call to order the special meeting of the Finance Committee. If the city clerk please call the roll.
Chairperson Clark.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Adams.
Here.
Councilmember McIntosh.
Here.
And Councilmember Taylor.
Present.
And welcome to all the other folks here. Mayor, welcome to you today. This is the kickoff meeting for the upcoming budget. The city manager released it last Friday. We will meet today from 4 to roughly 6 o'clock. The next meeting will be this coming Thursday, same place, same time, 4 o'clock as well. It is our goal to have a budget ready to present at the second meeting of the council in June. So that's what we're heading towards. Also, before we get going, I know a lot of people will have questions. You may certainly ask them today. I would say if you have a lot of questions, get up with Mr. Tesh separately, and that way you can take whatever time you need to go over them, and he can provide them answers. As you know, the budget office will put out a sheet or sheets of paper that will have the answers, and that package grows as we add to it, but they will be addressed and sent back to you as we proceed. With that, Mr. Tesh, I think you're going to run the meeting. Is that right? Or Mr. Garrity, would you like to make a few opening comments?
Good evening, Chairman Clark, Mayor Joines, members of the City Council, Mayor Pro Tem Adams. Yes, just very quickly, this budget, you'll see two themes in this budget, two primary themes. And one is inflation and the cost of doing business, particularly the cost of labor. And the second, unfortunately, major theme in this budget is gun violence. And you will see how significant the challenges we are facing with gun violence. And there's a lot in here to try to address that, particularly related to retaining and recruiting police officers. This is my last budget. I just want to thank you all for working on all these budgets. This is actually, I counted up my 33rd budget. I don't know what the tax rate was for my first budget. I need to go look that up. But in any case, it's been a pleasure to do this, and I think we look forward now. As I always say, this budget now becomes, it was my recommended budget, now it is your budget. We are here to change it in any way that you'd like us to. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee.
Thank you. Mr. Tesh, you have the floor.
Chairman Clark, Mayor Pro Tem, and members of the Finance Committee and Council. Before we get going, I do want to do two things. One is say thank you to Mr. Garrity. He had admitted this is his last budget, as he will be retiring here in a couple of weeks. So I wanted to say thank you to Mr. Garrity for at least my two budgets. It's nice to have somebody that was formerly in the budget office at the helm that understands and can provide leadership in terms of fiscal direction. I would also like to say thank you to my staff, who likes to hide a little bit in the back, but it is because of their hard work for the last several months that I am able to stand here before you and present the summary of the information that they have spent those months compiling for us. So just wanted to publicly say thank you to the budget and performance management staff. Hopefully everyone can see the presentation up there. So we're going to talk about four things in general. Have a couple of slides on the total overall budget for the city as an introduction to the fiscal year 24 and the changes from the overall budget from the current fiscal year 23. Talk very specifically about employee compensation and how it affects our different employees. Spend a good amount of time talking about the general fund, which is the fund where we provide a majority of our general purpose services, police, fire, sanitation, recreation, and the like. And then also take a look at a couple of the enterprise fund long-term financial forecasts, particularly for those that may be trending in a direction where we need to pay a little more attention to them in the coming years. From a total budget perspective, you will see that the total budget is down. We'll talk about this on the next slide as to why. You can see from the different parts of the bar chart here, the operating budget has increased, which you would expect, as Mr. Garrity said, with the inflation that we are seeing. Debt service is up slightly based on additional general obligation debt payments. And then the real decrease there is in the capital. If you will remember, last year, as part of the budget process, you approved a $55 million limited obligation bond package targeted mostly at capital maintenance projects. So we have a $55 million change off the bat for not having a bond package as part of the recommended budget this year. So the overall decrease in the budget is roughly $22 million. You can see from the table there the major drivers, capital being one, but compensation is up, supplies and services is up, and then we talked about debt service. compensation notes on the side, and we will talk in great detail about these. This budget includes no net new positions, so the authorized position count from fiscal year '23 is the same to '24. No new authorized positions. We do have all of the different types of employee compensation changes later in the presentation, as well as the benefits, many of them related to retirement. And then wanted to note also, as we will a couple of more times, that this budget also includes a full year of the BEAR team, as well as the in-house recycling collection program that were both partially funded in fiscal year '23, as they didn't start on July 1 of this fiscal year. The pie chart that we have here shows you by service area where the largest expenditures are in the city's budget. Excuse me. This doesn't tend to change much from year to year. As you know, the environmental health section tends to be the largest. That is because the water and sewer system is in there, both with their operations and capital. Public safety includes police, fire, and EMS. You can see debt management, and then on down from there. On the revenue side, the three largest sources of revenue are property taxes, charges for service, and sales taxes. Property taxes and sales taxes make up 75% or more of your general fund revenues, and the charges for service at a total budget level, these are related to the enterprise fund charges for service, particularly water and sewer fees. As we talk about those revenues, we'll stop for a second. There are three major tax and fee changes that are in this proposed budget. The first is an increase of 2.5 cents to the property tax rate, which is roughly 3.9%, up to 66.1 cents per $100 of valuation. The other is the water and sewer fees, roughly 7%, which would be effective in July. The City County Utilities Commission sets those rates, and they have recommended such to you. And then the last one we see down at the bottom that we have talked many times about over the course of the last year is an increase in stormwater rates of 8% that will be effective in January. So you will have roughly a 4% increase for the fiscal year, as it will only be effective for 6 months out of the year. That is the first stormwater rate increase in 15 years. What does that mean for an average resident? And I'm going to tell you, many of you know housing costs are getting very expensive. And so when we look at median home values, the median home value here in Winston-Salem or Forsyth County is rising considerably, as it is across our state and across our nation. The proposed property tax difference there, as you can see in the assumptions, is based on a median home value in Forsyth County, which is currently about $250,000. A median home or average resident would pay about $64 additional per year in property taxes. Water and sewer charges would run about $41 for the average residential customer, more than fiscal year '23. And the stormwater fee increase would be $2 per year. And the additional 4% you would see increased in FY '25, again, as that's in January. That's roughly $9 a month for the average resident in the city of Winston-Salem. In terms of our property tax base and how it is growing and has been growing, Forsyth County Tax Office provides us an estimate of the changes in real personal property, registered motor vehicles, and public service companies as part of the tax base. You will see there, that last bullet point on the right, they have estimated roughly 1.9% growth, which is a little less than the average of the last three non-revaluation years, which were about 2.25%. So what they are projecting and what is the assumption in this proposed budget for the tax base is a little lower than what we've seen on average in the last couple of years. We include a history of the property tax rate going back to fiscal year 11. Again, this proposed budget includes an increase of 2.5 cents per $100 of value. Roughly $0.015 of that is for operations outside of police pay, and roughly $0.01 of that is related to what you will see in the compensation section when we talk about the police pay plans and the minimum adjustments in those plans. We'll also note that we will talk about one of the other offsets for police pay is a reduction in the number of vacant positions that they are authorized in the Winston-Salem Police Department. We talk about sales tax about once a quarter, and we pull out our crystal ball and try and figure out exactly where it's going to go. What I would tell you is probably most important in this chart is you see those two numbers of roughly 15% between FY21 and 22, where we were having revenue growth in the 15% area. I do not think we will see that to year end here, and we are obviously projecting a little less next year. You can see from the bullet point on the left that through February, we were at 8.5% growth, and we have projected 6% through the end of this fiscal year. And then for next year, we're projecting 4%. In talking with our peers, there are a lot of folks at different levels, but everywhere that I have talked to is somewhere between 0 and 6%. I think Greensboro may have even gone to 7% in some of their proposed budget workshops. So I don't think we're outside of what our peers are doing. And this is reflective of inflation is going up, but there is a lot of talk generally about a potential downturn. I think we were having the same conversation about a year ago as I stood here expecting a downturn that did not come, but we are seeing that things are starting to flatten off a little bit, and so we are reflecting that in the proposed budget. So we're going to transition here and talk about employee compensation. For the general pay plan for the regular employees, an average 6% merit, that works out to 4.5%, 5.5%, or 6.5% based on the annual performance evaluation. Based on our process, that adjustment would be made in the first full pay cycle in the month of October, and we would be moving all of the plan minimums by 3% in January. That would make the city's new minimum wage $15.45 per hour on January 1st of 2024, which is also a 3% increase. In addition to that, as we talked about at trial balance budget, we are looking at doing a one-time supplemental payment using general fund balance in the general fund and fund balances of the other funds respectively there. What has been worked up, you see here on the slide, those with annual salaries under $100,000 would receive a $2,000 one-time supplement. Those with salaries greater than that would be $1,000. And we have up there that it applies to permanent, part-time, and temporary workers that meet the eligibility. Human Resources does have eligibility requirements for this, including that you must have been employed with the city prior to January 1 of the current calendar year, and there are a few other eligibility requirements. What this costs the general fund is roughly $5.2 million. Again, this is all one-time funding, but $2.2 million of it would come from our unassigned fund balance or the savings account, and then another $3 million would come from the revenue replacement funding that came from the American Rescue Plan Act. Total cost across the entire city with benefits is almost $7 million, and again, outside of the general fund, we are just using fund balances or the cash reserves in those funds to cover that. The intent is to have this in an off-cycle paycheck so that employees would see it, would understand that it is a one-time supplement. So they would have a regular paycheck, the supplement, and then they would return to their regular paycheck so that they would see it that way. Why are we doing this? We talked about this at trial balance budget, but to help offset hardships, particularly for those at the bottom of the pay ranges that we have, recognizing that there is additional workload that is being taken on by a lot of our employees, as we are currently at roughly 20% vacancy citywide. We will look at that by department here shortly. And as we have mentioned previously, there is money, one-time money, in the 24 budget to do a compensation and classification study. And so in part, this one-time funding would be a bridge of sorts until that pay study is completed and we have a better idea of what some of those positions might need to be paid on an ongoing basis going forward. Again, equity focused to provide those at the bottom of our pay scales with the largest incentives. It does represent more than a 6% increase to those who are at the city's minimum wage. And again, talked about would have to have been with the city in January of this year in order to get it. Moving on down the line, we'll talk about the fire and police pay plan changes. So the fire step plans, they will have a 3% increase for all current employees in July, and then another 3% in January of 2024. Everyone in the fire department will also be eligible for that $1,000 or $2,000 supplement. We will move the fire pay plan minimums by 3%, just as we did for the general pay plan in January of 2024. And the last bullet point there is just a note that you did make changes to the fire pay plan last year to create career ladder opportunities, and there will be those eligibilities continue going forward. The sworn police pay plan is a little bit different. There are some larger changes here. The new starting salary for a police officer with no education incentive, no military incentive, would be $52,500 a year. This is roughly the exact same amount that the city of Greensboro has proposed in their budget. There have been a lot of other cities that have made adjustments to this. Some smaller cities than us that are paying as much as $57,000 and $60,000 a year for entry-level police officers. And so we are in some ways chasing the market with these, as there are a lot of vacancies across the state and across the nation in sworn law enforcement. These pay plan changes would be effective in July of 2023, and we would provide compression adjustments of 4% for anyone who is already above the minimum. We would also have the step plan, just like we have for fire, of 3% in July and 3% in January. What that would mean is that there is no current police employee who would receive less than 10.3%. They would get compression, and then those two step adjustments, if they were below the minimum, then they would be moved to the minimum and get the steps on top of that. And also, just as with everyone else, everyone in police is eligible for the $1,000 or $2,000 supplemental one-time pay. Police is getting different treatment with respect to pay plan increases than what we see elsewhere. The rationale for that, as Mr. Garrity has already talked about, is there has been an increase in violence, not just in our city, but again, across our state and across our nation. We currently, or at least at the last time I checked, had 152 sworn law enforcement vacancies. The map that you see there displays weapons violations for roughly a 7-week period. As you can see, it is spread across our city. There were more than 1,000 weapons violations just in the first 5.5 months of this year. If you take the crime data that we see specific to weapons, and we look at homicides by gunfire, if you take the last 3 years, the average was 26. If you take where we were at the end of April and you straight line project it through the end of the year, you get 44, which is a nearly 70% increase in homicides by gunfire. You see discharging of firearms increasing nearly 10% and all weapons violations at 7%. The bar charts below that show the same information, but we are seeing significant increases in the use of weapons in our community. And we have a specific need to recruit and retain as many police officers as we can, given the significant number of vacancies that we have. Which leads us to departmental vacancies. You can see that the police department, now that includes both sworn and non-sworn positions, at a roughly 33% vacancy rate, 1 in 3 positions being vacant. The only area or department that has higher vacancy than that is traffic field operations, and that is to do a lot with our ability to recruit and retain light equipment operators, medium equipment operators, and the like. This chart does exclude, as you see at the bottom, departments that have fewer than 25 employees. For instance, the city clerk had 1 employee at the time I pulled this data, which gave them a 25% vacancy rate, but with only 4 employees. Kind of skewed the chart a little bit. So we've removed a couple of the departments, but you can see the citywide vacancy rate is at roughly 20.4% there. So we have some departments that are well above that, some who are doing a little bit better, but you see that there are certain departments that have less than 10% vacancy rates, which is lower than what we would have seen on average pre-pandemic. I showed you this chart as part of either early forecast or trial balance budget. We're in about the same place we were a couple of months ago. Again, when we look at the departmental vacancy chart and we see the folks that are below the city average of 20%, it is good context to keep in mind that it wasn't too many years ago that on average our vacancy rate was half of that. You would have expected to see half of our departments below a 10% vacancy rate. That is the summary of compensation changes. In terms of the pay plans, we will talk a little bit about retirement benefits at a higher level when we get to that as part of the general fund presentation. So here's the one large table that shows everything that's moving in terms of the general fund. at a high level for revenues and expenditures. We see an 8.1% increase in property tax revenues. That is because we are raising the tax rate 2.5 cents plus the 1.9% organic growth that we're getting. Sales tax at 13.4%. We were a little conservative this year in budgeting compared to what the revenue source is actually coming in. So we are capturing that growth, plus we have the 4% growth on top of it that we're projecting for next year. Not a significant increase in other revenues. And it did want us to show the change in fund balance, but we will talk specifically about fund balance. It is being used all for one-time purposes. There is no general fund balance being used for an ongoing operating expense that will not come out of the budget. On the personnel side, 10% increase. With all of the compensation changes that we have in this, that's actually not as large as one might have expected, partially due to the significant amount of vacancy that we have. Vacant positions don't get merit, and so 20% of your organization, the rate for that authorized position stays the same. Supplies and services at just over 7%, we will talk about on another slide, but as Mr. Garrity said, a lot of that is due to inflation. Contracts are up, supplies are up, and we are feeling that. Interdepartmental credits are just one of the ways that we charge ourselves for certain things. As you can see, that's about flat year to year, but increases slightly based on some of the other things going up. I do want to note the lease payments at $1.9 million addition. That is vehicle replacement. We, during COVID, have gotten behind, and we are needing to catch up, and this is the second year of having a somewhat significant increase in the amount of vehicle and equipment replacements in the general fund so that we can give our employees the tools that they need to get the job done every day. And we will talk about transfers, but realistically, part of that was one-time funding last year that we transferred to Capital Projects Fund, so we're seeing a reduction in that amount as we're not spending as much cash one-time on capital projects. So we've talked about personnel already. Again, you see the 9.7% increase, or roughly $17 million in the general fund. We have upped the salary savings adjustment just a little, roughly $300,000. I will tell you, though, as we will discuss here with the reduction of 50 vacant police officer positions, that is a significant reduction in the actual salary savings we will see as that pay goes into current officers and away from vacant ones. So we are only budgeting a $300,000 increase, but again, that's what we're projecting based on how many vacancies we have citywide. We'll run through these bullet points very quickly. We've talked about the average 6% merit for everyone on the general pay plan. Contributions for retirements were both in general pay plan and police benefits factors up between 0.75% and a full percent, so we are paying more for retirement. We've talked about the pay plan changes and compression adjustments for police. Again, 50 vacant police officer positions, and I will hit this 2 or 3 more times. There is not a police officer that is going to lose a job. These are vacancies that we simply cannot fill and have not been able to fill for quite some time. Talked about the minimum wage increase up to $15.45 per hour. Have talked about recycling and the BEAR programs being fully funded for a full year this year, where they were partial years in '23, and the supplement as well. The bullet point at the bottom there, just to note for employees who may be watching, we do have quite a few things changing in our different pay plans, and they do have different effective dates. So if you have questions, feel free to reach out to Budget, HR, the manager's office, whomever, and we'll make sure that you know exactly when your pay might change. Again, just so that everyone sees it, vacant positions, roughly 152 current sworn law enforcement vacancies. And we will be using the savings from those 50 positions with an additional penny on the tax rate to move police minimums to $52,500. On the non-personnel side, what's changing? Supplies and services, you saw at a 7% increase, as well as we talked about the $1.9 million in equipment lease payments. Supplies and services, we have another slide here. Well, we will talk about it, how inflation is affecting us and some of the other things that are buried in the budget that are one-time expenditures from some of that fund balance. On the equipment lease payments, again, we are really in need of catching up, but would also note that a lot of the vehicles we are purchasing are coming in significantly higher than what they have in previous years. That 10 to 40% is kind of a good average range, but we are seeing vehicles come in at 50+% that may have been budgeted 18 or 24 months ago and have seen significant increases. The delivery times for these also continue to be an issue. That is something that fleet will continue to work on. So there are potentially vehicles that we will budget for this year that we may not be able to take delivery of in the fiscal year 24. To hit some of the high points of what's going on inside our supplies and services, the two top bullet points up there, first, we do have a $1.5 million reduction in the recycling contract. We brought collection in-house here in April, and so a full year's worth of savings is $1.5 million or more, in the general fund. Other contracted services, there are just a lot of things in other contracted services that we are seeing for inflation, and there are some additions, specifically in the police department for things related to the real-time crime center that we have already signed on to. Many of these were unavoidable expenses, things we've already committed to, and we are just realizing the cost as part of the 24 budget. We do have an overall net increase in information services charges. That is another area where things are tending to get more expensive. All of the applications that we have, the maintenance and support of those every time we come to re-up or to rebid those is increasing. Would note vehicle maintenance and repairs, until we can get those new vehicles that we are budgeting on site, it is costing significantly more to fix the older vehicles that we have. So those are charges in the general fund that we expect fleet to be charging out to service those older vehicles. I do have a significant increase in the budget for firefighter turnout gear. It was about 10 years ago that the City Council decided to give firefighters a second set of gear for safety and health reasons, and a lot of that gear is coming to the end of its 10-year life cycle, and so we find ourselves in need of replacing majority of it. You will see this in next year's budget too, as we are trying to phase that in over time. Mowing is one that we can specifically, and grounds maintenance costs, call out. We have mowing contracts, you have seen them, that are being rebid in excess of 40% of what they were just a few years earlier. So the vegetation management budget is up nearly $600,000 just for contract increases for mowing. Operating electric, specifically for street lighting, we are expecting Duke to increase rates, so that is contingent upon a rate increase for Duke based on what our energy management coordinator has told us to expect. Fuel is up. Everyone who drives a car knows that gas at the pump is a little more expensive than it was last year. It has been up and down, and so we have settled on a number for next year that's about equivalent to what we're paying right now, as we don't see anything in energy projections to expect significant increases next year in energy prices for fuel. And would note there, we do have some temporary services that are increased. A lot of that is actually related to the one-time supplement, as it is eligible to temporary service workers who work with us on a regular basis. And so that's not a personnel increase per se. That's in our supplies and services because we pay it through a contract. So there is a lot in terms of that 7% increase in our supplies and services, but there is a lot that we really, from an inflation perspective, are not able to eat in the current budget. Talked about equipment replacement. Got a few pictures up there. We do have several sanitation vehicles. Those are the Winston Lake golf carts. Actually a picture of them. So we will have budgeted to replace those next year. Have 3 fire trucks in the budget, as well as we've told you several times, all of the light vehicles in fleet will be purchased as hybrids. They are available, so that is a Camry hybrid, which is the most recent hybrid sedan purchase that we have made. There is a large list of the vehicles and equipment that we are replacing. They are in the budget document in the supplemental section. I won't go through all of them. If you have any questions, let me know. But it is, I think, almost $13 million worth of equipment in the general fund. We did talk about there was an increase in the use of fund balance from last year. So this slide calls out essentially kind of what we're using that money for. The top is the unassigned fund balance, so what we're using the savings account for. What you see for that $700,000 is essentially 3 one-time studies, one for a human resources information system implementation study. We have a very old HRIS system. It is causing some issues, and so we are looking in the early stages at how to replace that and the best methods to do so. We have talked a couple of times about a sustainable fleet study, looking at moving the city's fleet to electric vehicles, and where we can't do electric vehicles, what other alternative fuel vehicles we could use for every vehicle type that we have, everything from the smallest car all the way up to fire trucks and transit buses. And then we've mentioned the compensation and classification study. I believe Human Resources has already written the RFP for this, and we would get that out with the passage of this budget as quickly as possible to do full compensation and classification of all position types in the entire organization. We do have some one-time capital there. Recreation security improvements includes a lot of new cameras and infrastructure at many of our recreation facilities. We have an agreement with the school system, and it is our turn to redo the Haynes Park track. You see there the Overdale Southdale Road. It says gap funding. A majority of that project is covered by 2/3 bonds, but we were a little short, so we're stealing a little bit from the savings account. That is a $2.2 million street project on the south side of town. We do have some fire station fuel tanks that need to be replaced. You will see that in this year's budget, and then subsequently in other budgets as we make our way around to replace all of those older fuel tanks, as well as an air compressor need in the fire department as well that we're going to go ahead and pay cash for. The other part of the fund balance, so that's $4.5 million that we're going to take out of the savings account. The other part is coming from what is left over from ARPA. $3 million of it goes directly to that supplemental one-time pay. The other parts, grant monitoring, those are the positions that are dedicated to doing the monitoring of the more than $10 million worth of contracts that have been issued to community agencies. And so we will continue to see those grant monitoring costs until those grants have been exhausted. And then we are using a small amount of money to continue to help fund the second year of the BEAR program as it gets fully up and going. And in FY25, it would become a full general fund operation. So roughly $8 million worth of using the savings account. But again, none of this is to subsidize operations. It is a best practice not to use one-time money to cover ongoing operating costs. Where do we think we're going to end the year for the general fund? This is a $17 million projected increase to general fund balance. I would call your attention to the difference between the top two, I'm going to call it Duke blue colors up there. I'm a Carolina fan, that hurts me to say that. But
Change the color.
I've got it snuck away in there a couple of blocks down. That top part of the column is really what we are projecting to add to unassigned fund balance or to the savings account. So you can see us going from $7.2 million to $11.5 million. The rest of that increase is related to the fact that we brought the ARPA money into the general fund because of accounting standards, and it will be spent over the course of the next years for all of the programs that you have already set it aside for. So that portion that says assigned for ARPA or appropriated for ARPA, that money is eventually just going to go away as that former ARPA money is spent. So we are projecting to add to our unassigned fund balance at the end of this fiscal year by a few $1 million. Each year when we present the budget, we look at city tax and fee comparison, where we look compared to other cities in North Carolina, specifically the 4 other largest cities. I will tell you this chart becomes a little more interesting with the median home values as they continue to skyrocket, not only here, but in other cities in North Carolina. So with our tax rate, our average water and sewer charges, plus stormwater and mandatory solid waste charges, we are looking at an average resident paying roughly $2,372 a year in these selected taxes and fees. That is above Charlotte, roughly equal, but a little bit less than Greensboro, and significantly less than Raleigh and Durham. I think folks look at this and they say Raleigh and Durham's tax rates are lower than ours, but when you apply that tax rate to median home values that are significantly higher, what you get are significantly higher property taxes being paid by those residents. Councilmember McIntosh, I believe it was last year, you asked us to look at the National Association of Realtors data with respect to this. We pulled the most recent county-wide data that we could access, and the median home value in Durham County compared to Forsyth County was 56% higher. So their tax rate may be a little bit lower than ours, but if you're paying it on a home that costs 50% more, you're going to pay more in taxes, and that's reflected in this chart. The other thing I would note, you will see that we have the smallest use of the other cities and fees. Many of the other large cities are charging additional fees, particularly for solid waste collection. We continue to rely specifically on the property tax rate for many of those services to generate the revenue for that. In many cases, that is a less regressive form of revenue generation, but there are other cities whose tax rates seem a little lower, but they're charging flat fees for things that we're not currently charging for. So we talked that we would look at selected enterprise funds. The first one we'll talk about is WISTA, the Winston-Salem Transit Authority. As Councilmember Clark has noted before, this is one that we have shown projections where it continues to look in out years like we will have a need for additional resources. That is the case with the assumptions that we currently have in this. As you can see, right now, what is happening is that we are standing up the operation on a lot of the COVID money that is still coming in or that we have access to. When that money falls away, we will begin to run operating deficits, and that is why you see essentially that chart going down significantly in fiscal years 25 and 26. We have, as an assumption, continued a lower amount of fare box revenues based on what we're actually seeing right now. If fare box generation were to return to pre-COVID levels, that would obviously be a good help for the fund, but that's not going to fix all of the problems that it has. We do have higher operating expenditures. Labor, fuel, maintenance are all more expensive. And I would strongly suggest that we come back to Finance and/or Public Works Committee sometime in the fall and look at both of the revenue and the expenditure side of this. I do believe that HDR is also coming back with a couple of different options, so that would be a good time to look at the overall revenue and expenditure forecasts from a long-range perspective for the transit fund. Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Tesh, could you also, in that report, show, just like we do with the taxes, what our sister cities are spending, a trend line or Pareto, on their transportation departments or needs as well?
We'd be more than happy to do that.
Thank you.
Yes.
Per capita.
We can do a full benchmarking report with standardizations. So Winston-Salem Fairgrounds reserves, we talked about this once or twice. You see a significant decrease in fiscal year 21, and then it pops back up in 2022. That is related, again, to ARPA money via revenue replacement that we moved into that fund to help stabilize it. Again, we have higher operating expenditures, and revenue is not keeping up with the operating expenditures that we have. So this fund would continue to experience operating deficits roughly in the $700,000 to $900,000 a year range without significant changes to either the revenue structure or reductions in expenses.
And Mr. Tesh, I think you told me, go back a minute, that coming out of this fund also is a subsidy for the Bowman Gray Stadium.
That's the second bullet point on this next slide.
Okay.
Yeah. Historically, losses in the Bowman Gray Stadium Fund have been covered by the Fairgrounds Fund, and so that projection includes transferring money to Bowman Gray Stadium to cover operating losses at that facility. Again, this is an item where we would need to bring something back to City Council, as what you see essentially going into the fiscal year 25 is the general fund having to provide operating support to that fund. Stormwater Management Fund, we have talked about stormwater rate increases for quite some time. This projection only includes the 8% rate increase that would happen in February of 2024, so that you can see without additional rate increases, the fund continues to go down. There are $30+ million worth of capital projects currently outstanding that are budgeted, and as we finish those projects, that is a large part of what is drawing down on this fund. I will also say that the operating side of this, because of our vacancy rate, is actually spending less money. If we go through a period of time where we are able to hire many of those employees that are currently vacant, this is a fund that you would see turn even more in terms of being able to get to a lot of the operating maintenance on our stormwater system that needs to be completed.
Ms. Adams.
Mr. Tesh, also look at the infrastructure money that will be coming in the year and next year. Just project ahead that would the infrastructure money assist us with that general fund in the next year or two?
If we were able to secure grants to do capital, that would absolutely help those. We do not project them into the pro formas unless we've actually been awarded that money and know it's coming in. But if we could receive money to offset current capital projects, that would definitely help the fund, yes, ma'am.
Are we ready, set to go to apply for infrastructure?
I would have to turn to the city manager to specifically answer questions about capacity.
Thank you, Mr. Tess. Mayor Pro Tem Adams, we have been looking at all the different grant opportunities. Ms. Oliva and our consultant, Leslie Mazingo, and myself, we met last week and looked at all the different grant applications to see which ones that we were most competitive on and which ones we could gear up this year versus next year. So you'll start seeing some of them coming forward to you based on their recommendations for which ones they think we're competitive for and we can get.
Thank you.
Off-street parking fund. The parking fund is basically subsidized by roughly $700,000 or $800,000 a year by the general fund. Again, this is another one in FY22 where you see a significant increase in fund balance. That is because of the ARPA money that was infused through revenue replacement into many of our enterprise funds. The general fund has provided a subsidy to this fund for a few years and will continue to do so in this projection. The line is the general fund subsidy, and the bar is what would remain in fund balance. And as you can see, going forward, that is essentially the same number, meaning the general fund is kicking in money to keep the operation having a fund balance. I do want to note here the third bullet point is probably of significance. Even though this is an enterprise fund, we will be issuing general obligation debt for some of the improvements that are needed. We will talk about that on Thursday when we talk about the capital plan, but is in an area where we are using general obligation debt for an enterprise fund and wanted to note that. Again, we can bring something back to Public Works Committee in the fall looking at operating revenues and expenditures along with projects related to rates and whether pay stations and things of that nature. That is all I have from an operating budget overview. The next council meetings, again, Thursday at 4 o'clock will be a presentation on the city's capital improvement plan. That night at 6 o'clock, we will have a public hearing on the budget. The following Thursday at 4 o'clock, another budget workshop to discuss any of the responses to questions that have been posed and any changes that you would like to see made to the city manager's recommended budget. We do have June 13th as the Finance Committee if we need to have additional consideration of the budget. If not, on June the 8th, the Finance Committee would look at recommending the proposed budget, personnel resolution, and such with the property tax rate increase to the full council. And then, as Mr. Garrity said, on June the 20th is when council would have another public hearing and would have adoption of the budget for the fiscal year 23-24.
Mr. Tisch, I just had one quick question. When do you anticipate making the one-time payment?
I believe we are still working on that. I'll look to the city manager. The intent is late July or August to try to get it early in the fiscal year.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions or comments? I would say, again, if you have specific questions that you want more detail on, I recommend you actually meet with Mr. Tesh. I met with him this morning, probably for about an hour, and go over any questions, concerns you may have, and I will be checking with the committee members specifically to see what your concerns are as we move towards a budget adoption. With that, seeing no questions or comments, we will stand adjourned until Thursday at 4 o'clock.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you.